Why would a 23-year-old forward with lottery pedigree demand a trade the exact moment his contract allowed it? On Thursday, ESPN's Shams Charania reported that Jonathan Kuminga has officially demanded a trade from the Golden State Warriors. Kuminga became eligible to be traded on January 15th after a restriction from his new contract signed during the offseason was lifted. According to the report, as soon as that restriction expired, he requested Golden State trade him. The development wasn't shocking, given the contentious contract negotiation between Kuminga and the Warriors last summer, when the former lottery pick entered restricted free agency with his preference to play elsewhere already clear. Instead of trading him then, Golden State signed him to a 2-year, $47 million deal. Kuminga started this season strong, but injuries and what's been described as a general decline in his play resulted in his benching in December. He's been glued to the sideline ever since, not playing a single minute since a 9-minute stint on December 18th. He hasn't logged significant playing time since December 6th. The 23-year-old forward averaged 11.8 points and 6.2 rebounds on 43.1% shooting from the floor across 18 appearances this season. According to Charania, every major figure on the ground level of the Warriors organization agrees it's time for a trade. That's the public story. But according to sources close to the situation, the path from last summer's contract standoff to this week's trade demand reveals a relationship breakdown far more complicated than simple playing time disputes. People familiar with the matter say the tensions between Kuminga and the Warriors organization had been building for months before they exploded into this week's formal trade request. According to those briefed on internal discussions, the contract negotiation last summer wasn't just about money. It was about organizational philosophy, developmental approach, and fundamentally different visions of Kuminga's role within the franchise. Sources say Kuminga believed he'd earned a larger contract and a guaranteed featured role, while the Warriors' front office remained uncertain about committing significant resources to a player whose fit within their system remained unclear. What hasn't been reported publicly, according to people close to the organization, is that Golden State's decision to retain Kuminga, despite his stated preference to leave, created an inherently unstable situation that multiple people within the franchise predicted would eventually implode. Sources say there were voices within the Warriors organization last summer arguing that trading Kuminga then, when his perceived value was higher and before relationship damage became irreparable, represented the smarter, long-term move. But people familiar with those debates say the front office ultimately decided to bet on reconciliation and development rather than immediate separation. Behind the scenes, according to those briefed on the situation, the early portion of this season initially suggested that gamble might pay off. Sources say Kuminga started strong, his production warranted his playing time, and there were tentative signs that he might be finding a sustainable role within Golden State's system. People familiar with the coaching staff's thinking during that early stretch describe optimism that Kuminga was maturing as a player, and that the contentious summer might fade into distant memory. But the situation deteriorated rapidly, according to sources close to the organization. The combination of what's been described as injuries affecting his availability and performance, along with what some within the team viewed as declining effort or focus, created a tipping point in December. People familiar with the matter say head coach Steve Kerr made the decision to bench Kuminga not impulsively, but after extensive consultation with his staff and front office personnel. Sources describe this as a calculated organizational message rather than a knee-jerk reaction to a few bad games. What made Kuminga's benching particularly significant, according to those briefed on the internal dynamics, was the context of Golden State's roster construction. The Warriors had acquired Jimmy Butler at the previous year's trade deadline, a move that fundamentally altered the team's offensive hierarchy and defensive schemes. People familiar with the coaching staff's evaluations say Butler's presence created additional complications for finding consistent minutes and a defined role for Kuminga. Sources describe film sessions where the coaching staff struggled to identify lineups that maximized both players' strengths without creating defensive vulnerabilities or offensive redundancy. Behind the scenes, according to people close to the situation, Kuminga's complete absence from the rotation since mid-December wasn't just about on-court performance. It represented a broader organizational decision about prioritization and direction. Sources say the Warriors' coaching staff and front office had concluded that their championship window required maximizing the productivity of their established core rather than continuing to invest development minutes in a player whose long-term fit remained uncertain. People familiar with these discussions describe them as difficult but ultimately unanimous among the team's leadership. The timing of Kuminga's trade demand, according to those briefed on the matter, was clearly intentional and calculated. Sources say he and his representation had been monitoring the calendar closely, aware that January 15th represented the first moment he could formally request a trade under the terms of his contract. People familiar with Kuminga's thinking describe someone who felt disrespected by the benching, frustrated by what he viewed as broken promises about his role, and determined to force the organization's hand rather than waiting passively for circumstances to change. What hasn't been discussed publicly, according to sources close to the Warriors, is that the organization had been preparing for this possibility for weeks. People familiar with front office discussions say there had been preliminary conversations with other teams exploring Kuminga's trade value even before the formal request came. Sources describe these as exploratory rather than aggressive, but they indicated that Golden State understood the relationship had deteriorated beyond repair and that separation was likely inevitable. According to those briefed on the Warriors' current thinking, the challenge now involves extracting meaningful value for a player whose production this season has been limited and whose benching raises questions for potential trade partners. Sources say the front office believes Kuminga's talent and age still command interest from teams looking for developmental upside, but acknowledge that his 11.8 scoring average across just 18 games doesn't create the kind of leverage Golden State might have had if they'd traded him last summer, when his value appeared higher. The specific teams expressing interest, according to people familiar with league-wide discussions, reportedly include several franchises looking to acquire young talent with remaining developmental runway. Sources say these teams view Kuminga's struggles in Golden State as potentially circumstantial, a product of fit and opportunity rather than fundamental limitations. People briefed on these external evaluations describe organizations willing to bet that a change of scenery and a clearer role could unlock the potential Kuminga showed when he entered the league. Behind the scenes within Golden State, according to those close to the organization, there's reportedly recognition that the situation represents a failure on multiple levels. Sources say some within the front office believe the Warriors should have traded Kuminga last summer, rather than signing him to a deal that merely delayed the inevitable. Others, people familiar with internal debates, argue that the organization gave Kuminga every opportunity to prove himself and that his benching and eventual trade request reflect his own shortcomings rather than organizational mismanagement. What complicated the Warriors' evaluation, according to sources briefed on their internal analysis, was the challenge of separating Kuminga's actual performance from the constraints of his role within their system. People familiar with coaching staff discussions describe debates about whether Kuminga's limited production stemmed from declining play or from reduced opportunities and unclear offensive responsibilities. Sources say these debates became increasingly academic once the relationship deteriorated to the point where both sides clearly wanted separation. The Jimmy Butler factor, according to those close to the situation, loomed large in conversations about Kuminga's diminished role. While Butler's acquisition at the previous year's trade deadline addressed immediate championship needs, sources say it created downstream complications for younger players like Kuminga, who needed touches and minutes to develop. People familiar with the Warriors' strategic thinking describe this as an inevitable tension in organizations trying to balance veteran championship pursuit with youth development. And in this case, championship pursuit won decisively. What remained uncertain as trade discussions intensified, according to sources familiar with the situation, was what kind of return Golden State could realistically expect for Kuminga. People briefed on preliminary conversations say interested teams were offering packages centered around future draft picks and young players, but nothing approaching the value the Warriors might have commanded last summer. Sources describe a front office coming to terms with the reality that their bet on reconciliation and development had cost them significant trade leverage. The coaching staff's perspective, according to those close to the team, reflected pragmatic acceptance rather than regret. Sources say Steve Kerr and his assistants believed they'd made the right decision in benching Kuminga based on what the team needed to compete for championships. People familiar with the coaching staff's thinking describe them as focused on the players who remained committed to their system rather than dwelling on a relationship that had clearly run its course. League-wide, according to sources familiar with broader NBA conversations, Kuminga's situation became another data point in ongoing debates about restricted free agency and player empowerment. People briefed on discussions among rival executives say several teams viewed Golden State's decision to match Kuminga's contract despite his desire to leave as a cautionary tale, that retaining unhappy players rarely produces positive outcomes and often leads to exactly the kind of messy separation now playing out publicly. As the February 5th trade deadline approached, the question facing Golden State became straightforward. Accept whatever the current market offered for Kuminga, or continue negotiations hoping that multiple interested teams might bid up the price. For the Warriors, the answer seemed increasingly clear. According to sources close to the organization, there was broad consensus that the relationship had deteriorated beyond salvage, and that quick separation served everyone's interests better than prolonged dysfunction. Whether Golden State could extract meaningful value from a situation that had already cost them leverage and created organizational distraction remained the only question left to answer. If you found this breakdown insightful, take a moment to like the video. It helps this story reach more basketball fans who care about what happens beyond the box score. For more NBA stories inspired by real news, told with depth, context, and realism, subscribe to Beyond the Hardwood. And if you want to be here when the next chapter unfolds, turn on notifications so you don't miss our next investigation. Let us know what you think in the comments. Was this the right move, or is there more beneath the surface? Until next time, this is Beyond the Hardwood.